Ben Caldwell came up the basement stairs of the Sadler building with his toolbox in one hand and a handwritten invoice in the other. $200. He set the paper on the lobby counter in front of Carl Jessup, who picked it up, read the number, and slid it back. I didn't authorize this. Ben looked at him, looked at the invoice on the counter. He picked it up, folded it once, and put it in his jacket pocket. He lifted his toolbox and walked toward the front door without a word. Amy Sadler stood in the open doorway of her ground-floor studio, one hand on the frame. Ben passed within 3 feet of her. Their eyes met for 1 second, and he kept walking. The door closed behind him. Carl was already heading for the elevator. The invoice rode home in the pocket of a plumber on his way to pick up his son from school. $200. One invoice. One decision that didn't seem worth fighting over. But it's going to pull $2 million and everything inside this building down with it. Stay? Ben Caldwell had been running Caldwell Mechanical for 3 years. One man, one white van, a phone number stenciled on the side. Before that, he had been a senior mechanical engineer at Burke and Hollis, one of the largest construction engineering firms in western Pennsylvania. He designed plumbing, HVAC, and fire suppression systems for commercial buildings. His name sat on 3 patents related to pressure tolerance and high-rise water distribution. He had an office on the 9th floor of a downtown tower and a title that took 2 lines on a business card. His wife passed away 3 years ago. There was no long story. One day the house had 2 parents, and the next day it had 1. Afterward, Ben stopped being able to sit in conference rooms. The fluorescent lights seemed louder. The spec reviews felt like they were happening to someone else. He did not quit for his son. Sam was fine. Sam was steady. He quit because the work stopped meaning what it used to mean, and no amount of time in the building brought it back. He filed his resignation on a Tuesday, surrendered his laptop, and walked out of Burke and Hollis with nothing but his licenses and the engineering instincts he could not turn off. He moved to a smaller house in Lawrenceville, got his master plumber certification in 4 weeks, and started taking service calls. Leaking faucets, corroded water heaters, clogged mains. Jobs that used 10% of what he knew. That was enough. Mornings in the Caldwell house were quiet. Sam, his 10-year-old, sat at the kitchen table with cereal and whatever library book he was halfway through. Ben made coffee and checked his phone. Neither of them talked much before 7:30. Silence was how the house sounded when it was working. The Sadler building was a 4-story mixed-use property in Pittsburgh's Strip District, built in 1971. Amy Sadler owned it, 35 years old, inherited it from her father 4 years ago. She ran an interior design studio on the ground floor and leased the upper floors to small businesses. She had hired Greystone Property Management to handle the building's maintenance because running a design business and managing a 53-year-old building at the same time was more than one person could sustain. Carl Jessup was Greystone's regional property manager. 46, polo shirt, Bluetooth earpiece. He managed the Sadler building and 3 others in the metro area, all by the same method: quarterly budgets, pre-approved vendor lists, nothing without his authorization. He was not dishonest. He was a man who believed good management meant keeping expenses under the line on his spreadsheet. The problem that morning was a basement valve, corroded and dripping. Donna Phelps, the building superintendent, had texted Carl about it at 7:14. He did not respond. 6 hours later, Donna called Ben. She had used him twice before for jobs at her own house. She trusted his work. Ben replaced the valve in 90 minutes. But while he was on his back under the main line, he saw something else. 20 feet of the main cast iron supply pipe was severely corroded. Deep pitting, rust scale that flaked at the touch, and near the boiler, a section where the wall had thinned enough that he could press his thumbnail into the iron and feel it give. He sat on a bucket and wrote his service report the way he had written them at Burke and Hollis. Numbered items, severity rating, recommendation. Item 1, valve replaced, functional. Item 2, main water line, approximately 20 linear feet, severe corrosion. Recommended action, full replacement. Estimated cost, $45,000 to $60,000. Urgency, high. He drew a corrosion diagram by hand and marked the 3 worst spots with wall thickness measurements. He left a copy with Donna and emailed the original, along with the $200 invoice, to Greystone's service address. The next morning, Amy stopped Donna by the mailboxes and asked about the repair. Donna told her the valve was done, but the plumber had found something worse underneath. The main supply line was corroded. She had forwarded Ben's service report to Carl. Carl had replied with one word: noted. Amy sat with that for a moment. Then she called Carl. She asked two things: why the $200 invoice had not been paid, and what was being done about the pipe. Carl's voice was unhurried. He told her the plumber had not gone through Greystone's authorization system. Unauthorized work was not reimbursable. The pipe would be evaluated during Greystone's next scheduled maintenance visit. Amy pressed for a date. Carl said he would check the calendar and get back to her. The call resolved nothing. That evening, after her last client meeting, Amy sat at her studio desk and typed Caldwell Mechanical Pittsburgh into her browser. The website was a single page: a phone number, a service area, a license number, and nothing else. No testimonials, no project gallery, no about section. Just the minimum a business needed to exist online. But the Pennsylvania license number led to the state licensing database, and what she found there changed the way she understood everything that had happened in her lobby that afternoon. Ben Caldwell, Master Plumber, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Professional Engineer, Mechanical, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. She stared at the second credential for a long time. A PE in mechanical engineering was not a weekend certification. It was a 4-year degree, for years of supervised practice, and a 16-hour exam. Amy searched further, past the license page, and found his name in the public project records of Burke and Hollis. Listed as lead mechanical engineer on 3 commercial builds in the Pittsburgh metro area, including a 12-story mixed-use tower in Lawrenceville and a medical office complex in Shadyside that her own design firm had bid on 2 years ago. She had lost that bid. The mechanical systems in that building, the ones Ben Caldwell had designed, were part of the reason. They were too good. The architect had built the entire project around them. The man Carl Jessup had refused to pay $200 for a valve replacement had once designed the mechanical hearts of buildings 10 times the size of hers. And he had written a service report saying her building was in danger, and the report was sitting in Carl's inbox marked Noted. Amy pulled the service report from the folder Donna had given her and read it for the second time. This time she understood what she was reading. The numbered findings were not guesses, they were measurements. The severity scale followed an engineering standard she recognized from construction documents she had reviewed for her own design work. The hand-drawn corrosion map had wall thickness estimates at each marked point, each one written in the small, precise lettering of someone trained to put numbers on drawings that other people's safety depended on. This was not a plumber padding a bill. This was a field assessment by an engineer who could not turn off the part of his brain that documented risk, even when the job was 90 minutes and $200 and no one was going to read the report. She walked to the basement stairwell and looked down through the open door. Under the single overhead bulb, the new valve Ben had installed caught the light, bright copper against decades of dull iron. And next to it, running along the ceiling into shadow, 20 feet of pipe that a former senior engineer had told them was going to fail. Amy stood there for a long time. The building was quiet. The pipe was not making a sound. That was the problem. The kind of failure Ben had described did not announce itself. It waited, and then it was too late. Down there in the dark, the building's clock was running. No one with the authority to stop it was listening. A week passed. The invoice sat unpaid. No inspection was scheduled. Nothing in the basement changed except the corrosion, which did not require anyone's permission to continue. Amy called Carl a second time. She kept her voice professional, but did not leave room for deflection. She asked for 2 things: the written assessment of the pipe and a date for the repair. Carl told her Greystone's maintenance crew had surveyed the pipe and concluded it was within acceptable service parameters. Amy asked for the written report. Carl said he would forward it by end of week. Friday came and went. Monday morning, Amy sent a 2-line email requesting the document. Carl replied 3 hours later. The assessment was being finalized, and he reminded her that maintenance decisions fell under Greystone's contractual authority, not hers. It was the second time he had said that. The repetition was not accidental. He was drawing a line. Amy walked down to the basement that afternoon by herself. She was not an engineer. She could not read corrosion the way Ben could. But she stood under the main line and looked at the section nearest the boiler, the spot Ben had described in his report, and even without training, she could see it. The surface of the iron was not smooth. It was layered and flaking, and in the fluorescent light, it looked less like metal and more like something that had been underground for decades. She reached up and touched it. A piece of rust scale the size of a quarter broke off in her hand. Donna found her by the loading dock Tuesday afternoon. She did not sit down. She said what she had been holding back for days. The corrosion Ben had flagged was not news to her. Donna had submitted a maintenance request about the same pipe to Carl 11 months earlier, typed it out herself, attached a photograph, marked it urgent. Carl had reclassified it as low priority and never revisited it. Before that, Amy's father had replaced a 12-foot section of the same line in 2009, the worst portion at the time. The rest was original. 1971. Over half a century of cast iron carrying pressurized city water through a heated basement, expanding and contracting with every season, thinning a little more each year. The pipe Ben had flagged was not a new problem. It was an old problem that had been waiting patiently for someone to stop ignoring it. Donna looked at Amy across the loading dock. I told Carl last March. I have the email. That sentence changed the shape of everything. This was not a disagreement between a property manager and an outside plumber over a $200 invoice. This was a pattern. Two separate people, 11 months apart, had told Carl Jessup the same thing. He had ignored both of them. Amy went back to her studio and sat at her desk for a long time before she picked up the phone. Then she called Ben. She left a voicemail identifying herself as the building's owner, not as Greystone, not as a client, and said she wanted to understand the full scope of what he had found in her basement. Ben called back the next day. His voice carried no edge, no trace of the unpaid invoice, no resentment that someone had done work in good faith and been told it did not count. He spoke the way engineers speak when they are describing a condition, flat, precise, impersonal. Amy asked directly, how bad was the pipe? Ben did not qualify it. If the system takes a pressure spike, a cold snap, the boiler running at full load, anything that pushes the line past normal operating range, that corroded section can fail. Not in a few years. Not next season. In weeks. Maybe less, depending on conditions. Amy was quiet. She was doing the math that Ben had already done, the math that mapped the coming winter against the thinning iron and arrived at a number that was not zero. She told him she wanted to pay the $200 herself from her personal account, completely separate from Greystone. There was a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but the silence of someone choosing his next words carefully. It was never about the money, Ben said. Greystone refused the invoice because paying it means admitting the work happened. Admitting the work happened means acknowledging the service report. And the report says there's a pipe about to burst in your basement. The $200 isn't a billing dispute to them. It's the first page of a liability file they don't want to exist. Amy sat with that. The logic was clean and cold. Carl had not refused the invoice out of thrift or bureaucracy. He had refused it because the moment Greystone paid for the valve job, they would be on record as having received the report that came with it. And once they were on record, every day they did not act on the corrosion warning became a day of documented negligence. The $200 was not a cost. It was a door. Carl was keeping it shut. Ben asked one more question before the call ended. Does your management agreement with Greystone have an emergency override provision? Something that lets the building owner authorize maintenance directly when there's documented evidence of imminent structural risk. Amy did not. Amy sent Carl a formal notice the next morning, invoking the emergency override under Section 11. Greystone had 10 business days to schedule the pipe replacement, or Amy would hire an outside contractor and bill the cost to Greystone's operating account. Carl did not reply to Amy. He replied to Greystone's regional headquarters. He forwarded her notice with a 2-page memo calling her action an overreach and attaching his own assessment. A single paragraph stating the pipe was within serviceable life. He recommended headquarters reject the override and warn Amy that hiring outside contractors would breach the management agreement. Greystone sided with Carl. Their legal team sent Amy a letter arguing that the override clause required an independent third-party assessment, not a report from a contractor who had already billed the property. They called Ben's report a conflict of interest. Amy needed an independent inspector. She called 3 firms. The earliest appointment was 17 days out. She booked it, knowing the math was wrong. They were deep into week 2. Ben had said weeks. The inspector would arrive too late, and everyone involved knew it except the people pretending not to. She asked Ben to come to the building one more time, to mark the worst sections with a grease pencil so the inspector would know exactly where to look when he finally arrived. Ben came on a Wednesday afternoon. They went down to the basement together, the first time the two of them had stood in the same room since the day he walked past her in the lobby. Ben moved along the pipe with a flashlight in one hand and a grease pencil in the other, circling each compromised section and numbering them. He pointed things out as he went. The deep pitting where moisture collected at a low joint, the hairline fractures in the rust scale, the spot near the boiler where the wall thickness had dropped below a quarter of the original spec. He explained each finding in the same flat, technical voice. No emphasis, no urgency manufactured for effect. This was not persuasion. It was measurement. Amy watched him work. She had seen contractors in this building before, men who looked at a problem, gave a price, and left. Ben was not looking at a problem. He was reading a system, tracing the logic of its failure the way an engineer traces a schematic, already knowing which line would break, and when and why. This was not a plumber she was watching. This was someone who had stepped down from a career that built buildings like this one, and who still could not look at a pipe without seeing everything behind it. At the top of the stairs, she asked him something she had been turning over for a week. "Why did you leave Burke and Hollis?" Ben stopped on the landing. He looked at the stairwell wall, not at her. Sometimes you have to do less to hold on to the thing that matters. He did not explain. She did not ask. He walked to his van at the curb. Before he opened the door, he looked back at the building one more time. Not the way a person looks at something they are leaving, but the way a person looks at a gauge when the needle is past the red line and there is nothing left to adjust. On the 13th day after the invoice was refused, a cold front pushed across western Pennsylvania. The temperature in Pittsburgh dropped below 20 degrees before noon. The boiler in the Sadler building ran at full capacity all morning. The pressure in the main water line climbed with it, steady and invisible, the way pressure always climbs, without sound, without warning, until the thing that has been holding gives way. At 2:15 in the afternoon, the pipe broke. It failed at the exact section Ben had circled with a grease pencil 11 days earlier, the spot nearest the boiler, where the wall was thinnest, where his thumbnail had pressed into the iron and felt it yield. Water struck the basement floor at full municipal pressure. It pooled, rose, and within minutes began pushing through the mechanical chase and up the stairwell into the ground floor. Amy's studio took it first. 6 inches of water moved across the concrete slab, soaking bolts of sample fabric, reaching the plotter against the east wall, shorting the power strip under the main work table. Her laptop sat on the desk. Next to it, the external hard drive holding 3 active client projects, floor plans, material specs, render files. The water reached the drive at 2:22. The second floor took it slower. The accounting firm in the East Suite lost a file server for desktops and 11 boxes of paper records stored in a cabinet at floor level. Water came through the ceiling tiles and spread across the carpet until every square foot of it was dark. Donna cut the building's main supply within 8 minutes and called 911. Crews arrived in 14 minutes. But the broken section kept draining. Residual pressure and gravity fed the flow for another 20 minutes after the shutoff valve closed. Donna called Ben, not because it was his job, not because he owed anyone anything, because the emergency crew was standing in a flooded basement looking at a pipe layout they had never seen, and Ben was the only person alive who knew where the secondary shutoff valves were, the ones behind the old coal chute that did not appear on any drawing Greystone had on file. Ben arrived in 19 minutes. He went into the basement without pausing to talk. The water was chest-high near the boiler room. He waded through it to the coal chute wall, found the valve by feel behind a layer of calcium buildup, and opened it. He guided the crew to a second shutoff behind the north mechanical panel. Between the 2 valves, the remaining flow stopped within 40 minutes of his arrival. He came upstairs with his jeans soaked to the waist. Amy was standing in her studio, water at her ankles, equipment dark around her. Ben stood in the doorway. Their eyes met across the wrecked room. He did not say what both of them were thinking. Neither did she. There was nothing left for that sentence to fix. That evening, Amy sat alone in the studio with the industrial drying fans roaring around her. Her laptop had survived by accident. The desk was 2 inches taller than the waterline. She opened her email and built the timeline. Day 1, Ben's service report emailed to Greystone, documenting severe corrosion, recommending immediate replacement. Attached, the $200 invoice. Day 2, Donna forwarded the report to Carl. Carl replied at 9:47, One word. Noted. Day 7. Amy emailed Carl requesting action. Carl responded that the pipe was within acceptable parameters and the invoice was for unauthorized work. Day 10. Carl sent a memo to Greystone headquarters recommending rejection of Amy's override request. Day 13. The pipe burst. 13 days. Each one documented. At every point, Carl Jessup had the information, the authority, and the opportunity to act. At every point, he chose to protect his budget line instead of the building. Amy forwarded the entire email chain to her attorney with a single line, "Please advise." The call came back within the hour. The service report, the acknowledgement email, the rejected override, the subsequent failure. It was not a close case. It was arithmetic. The $200 invoice that Carl had pushed back across the counter was now the opening exhibit in a liability file that ended at 7 figures. The insurance adjuster arrived 2 days after the flood. He walked every floor with a clipboard and a moisture meter, photographing the water line on each wall, cataloging equipment losses, measuring the structural damage where the water had sat longest. His preliminary estimate covered structural remediation, equipment replacement, tenant business interruption, environmental abatement, and emergency costs. The total range, $1.8 to $2.2 million. He sat with Amy in the lobby afterward and asked for the building's maintenance history. She gave him everything: Ben's signed service report, the full email chain with Carl, the Greystone letters rejecting her override. The adjuster read the report, checked the date, and looked up. This was written 13 days before the failure. Greystone's attorneys arrived within the week. Their argument was narrow and practiced. Ben's service report was not an official building inspection. He had not been engaged by Greystone to assess the pipe. He had not followed Greystone's vendor protocols. Therefore, they argued, his warning carried no contractual weight, and Greystone bore no obligation to act on it, no more than they would be obligated to act on a note from a stranger left under the front door. Amy's attorney let them finish. Then he put one document on the table: Carl Jessup's reply to Donna's forwarded service report. One word: noted. Sent at 9:47 in the morning, the day after the report was filed. Under Pennsylvania premises liability law, a property manager who receives documented notice of a known hazard and fails to take reasonable action has met the threshold for negligence. The standard did not require the notice to come from an authorized inspector, a certified assessor, or anyone on Greystone's approved vendor list. The law required only that the responsible party had been made aware of a risk and failed to act. Carl's one-word reply proved awareness. The 13 days that followed, days in which he not only failed to act, but actively blocked the building owner's attempt to act, proved everything else. Carl was summoned to Greystone's regional office 3 days later. He walked in with a folder of procedural documents and an explanation he had clearly rehearsed. Donna, he said, had called an unauthorized contractor. The service report had never gone through official channels. The entire chain of events was the result of a superintendent acting outside her scope. But Donna had kept every text message on her phone. 7:14 in the morning, her first text to Carl about the leaking valve. 11:40, a second text, adding that the drip had increased. 12:55, a call to Carl's office line that rang through to voicemail. 1:18 in the afternoon, the call to Ben Caldwell. 6 hours and 4 minutes of documented silence from the man whose job title literally included the word responsive. The regional director looked at the timestamps, looked at Carl, and did not ask any more questions. Greystone suspended Carl from all managed properties pending a full internal review. He left the regional office with a cardboard box and a separation agreement he did not sign that day. In the vocabulary of corporate property management, administrative leave and termination are the same destination traveling at different speeds. Ben stayed out of the legal proceedings entirely. He provided his original service report, signed an affidavit confirming his findings on the day of the service call, and declined to participate further. He did not attend depositions. He did not give interviews. When Amy called him after the adjuster's visit to tell him what the damage estimate looked like, he was quiet on the other end for a long time. "I'm sorry about your studio," he said. Amy said, "I'm sorry about the $200. And Ben said, "You weren't the one who refused to pay it." In the weeks that followed, the damage extended beyond the Sadler building. Greystone's insurance carrier opened an audit of Carl's entire portfolio. If he had deferred maintenance at one property in the face of documented warnings, the insurer wanted to know whether the pattern repeated. 2 of his 3 other buildings were inspected within days. 1, a commercial complex on the north side, had a fire suppression system with 14 months of deferred pump tests. The quarterly inspection tags were signed and current. The actual work had not been done. Greystone did not have one bad manager. Greystone had a system that measured success by money not spent and never checked what the savings had cost. Amy terminated her contract with Greystone under the agreement's negligence clause. For the first time since her father died, the Sadler building had no property manager. Donna stayed. The walls stayed. The rest was starting over. The accounting firm on the second floor filed its own claim. Equipment, records, 3 weeks of business interruption while they ran out of a temporary space in Lawrenceville. Their number pushed the combined liability past $2 million. Amy needed someone to replace the main line and rebuild the building's mechanical systems from the basement up. She did not call Greystone's vendor list. She did not open a bidding process. She needed someone who already understood the building, the original pipe layout, the pressure map, the places where 53 years of water and weather and thermal cycling had worn the infrastructure thin. There was only one person who had walked that basement and read it like a blueprint. She called Ben. He did not answer the first time. She left a voicemail, shorter than the first one she had ever left him, which felt like a long time ago, but was only 3 weeks. He called back that evening, after Sam was in bed. Amy told him what she needed. Ben listened without interrupting. They met at the building the next morning. Amy walked him through every floor, the stripped drywall on the ground level, the bare concrete where her studio equipment used to sit, the industrial fan still running on the second floor where the accounting firm's carpet had been pulled up and hauled out in rolls. The smell of damp concrete was in every room, the kind of smell that seeps into the walls and stays for months. She asked if he would take the job, not a service call, but a full infrastructure contract. The pipe replacement, the system rebuild, the new isolation valves, the whole scope. Ben looked at the damage without speaking for a while. This was not a $200 morning. This was a $60,000 project, the kind of rebuild he used to manage at Burke and Hollis, the kind of work that required the part of his brain he had been keeping quiet for 3 years. He stood in the basement doorway and looked down the stairs into the space where he had waded chest deep through floodwater less than 2 weeks ago. He told her he needed to survey the full system before he could quote it. Donna met them in the lobby on the way out. She stopped at the basement door and looked at Amy. That valve he put in 2 weeks ago? Only piece of plumbing in the whole basement that held. Only one. Ben came back on Saturday to do the survey. He brought Sam, because the neighbor who watched him on weekends was out of town and Ben was not going to reschedule. Sam settled into a metal folding chair in Amy's studio, stripped to bare studs and concrete. A folding table by the window serving as her temporary desk. He opened his book and did not look up. Amy was at the table working through insurance documents. Without pausing her work, she reached into a small cooler on the floor and set a bottle of water on the windowsill next to Sam's chair. He noticed it, then went back to his page. Ben was in the basement for 2 hours. He mapped every pipe run, every junction, every shutoff valve. He measured wall thickness at 40 points with an ultrasonic gauge, recording each reading on a hand-drawn layout of the system. The basement was cold and damp and lit by temporary work lights that Donna had strung after the flood, and Ben moved through it with the ease of someone who had spent years in spaces like this, dark, mechanical, full of information if you knew where to read it. When he came up the stairs, his hands were dark with pipe grime and his clipboard was filled with numbers. He paused in the doorway of the studio. Sam was in the same chair, in the same posture, 50 pages deeper into his book. Amy sat at the same table with a calculator and a legal pad. Afternoon light came through the window and fell across the concrete floor between them. The room held a kind of quiet that felt like it had been there longer than the afternoon, like it belonged to the building itself, and the 3 of them were just the people who happened to be sitting inside it. Amy brought him coffee from a small machine on a filing cabinet. They sat across from each other at the folding table, and Ben spread his drawings between them. He walked her through the scope, which sections had to come out first, which could hold with monitoring, where new isolation valves should go. Amy followed the drawings and asked questions about sequencing that told him she was not just listening. She was learning the building. When the technical conversation was over, Ben stacked his papers and squared the edges against the table. Neither of them stood up. "The first time you came here," Amy said. "The faucet on the second floor. I remember you left the work area cleaner than it was before you started." Ben looked at her across the folding table. He did not look away. Sam closed his book and stood up. "Dad, are we done?" "We're done." The three of them walked out the front door together. Ben held it open. Greystone accepted the settlement 2 weeks later. $2,040,000, structural repair, pipe replacement, equipment losses, business interruption for Amy and the second-floor tenant, environmental work, and legal costs. Carl Jessup was terminated. Greystone placed all 4 of his former properties under new management with mandatory quarterly audits and third-party verification. Ben started the pipe replacement on a Monday. He brought in 2 plumbers from a shop he trusted in Lawrenceville, but he was the first one in the basement each morning. He checked the temporary bypass, read the gauges on the new isolation valves, and walked the length of the old pipe, marking the next section for removal. The same discipline he had carried at Burke and Hollis. The belief that the first hour of the day belonged to the system, not to the schedule. It was how he had always worked. It was the thing he had never been able to set down, even when he set down everything else. Donna came down each morning with coffee for the crew. She set the cups on a plywood sheet across 2 sawhorses, looked at the new copper gleaming where the old iron used to run, and went back upstairs. 18 years in this building had taught her the difference between people who managed maintenance and people who did it. She had stopped trying to explain the difference to anyone who didn't already know. On the 3rd morning, Amy came down the basement stairs. She was not checking the schedule or inspecting the work. She carried a second cup of coffee and nothing else. She stood at the bottom of the stairwell and watched Ben for a full minute before he noticed. He looked up from his clipboard. "Early for a building owner." "My building," she said. She walked over and stood beside him, looking at the pipe, new copper joined to old cast iron. The transition sharp and clean, 53 years of difference visible in 6 inches of metal. The basement smelled like solder and damp concrete, and the deep cold that old buildings hold in their lowest floors regardless of the season. Amy reached into her jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Ben. He opened it. A check for $200, signed by Amy Sadler. In the memo line, in her handwriting, "Invoice 0247, Caldwell Mechanical." Ben looked at the check, looked at Amy. He folded it once and put it in his jacket pocket, the same pocket where he had put the invoice the day Carl Jessup slid it back across the counter. Same pocket, same fold. The distance between the 2 pieces of paper was 13 days and $2 million. That afternoon, Ben picked up Sam from school. They drove through Lawrenceville with the van's heater running and the windows cracked an inch. Sam watched the row houses go by for a while, then turned his head. "Are you going to work at that building for a while?" "For a while," Ben said. Sam turned back to the window. That was enough. The next morning, Ben was in the basement of the Sadler building before 6. The fluorescents hummed on. He picked up his clipboard, checked the first gauge, and started walking the line. New copper on the left, old iron waiting its turn on the right, the building settling around him the way old buildings do when someone is paying attention. Upstairs, the lights in Amy's studio came on. Somewhere above him, in a room being rebuilt from the studs out, the owner of this building was starting her day in a space that was coming back, not because the settlement had paid for it, but because someone had shown up early enough to keep the rest from falling apart. Neither of them had planned it this way, but some mornings, the one who arrives first is the one who never stopped paying attention, and the one who arrives second is the reason it was worth staying.